Sarah Martinez had always known she was different. Growing up in a small Texas town where football was king and women were expected to cheer from the sidelines, she chose a different path. While other girls her age were trying out for cheerleading squads, Sarah was learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from her father, a former Marine who believed his daughter should know how to defend herself in any situation. Her childhood was filled with early morning runs, weekend camping trips that felt more like survival training, and evenings spent learning military history. Her father, Miguel Martinez, never pushed his military dreams onto his daughter, but he made sure she understood what real strength meant. He taught her that being tough wasn't about being the loudest person in the room or the one who could throw the hardest punch. True strength came from discipline, mental toughness, and the ability to stay calm when everyone around you was losing their minds. When Sarah turned 18, she shocked her entire hometown by announcing she was joining the Navy. Not as a nurse or an administrative assistant, which is what most people expected, but with the goal of becoming a Navy SEAL. The idea seemed impossible to everyone except her father, who simply nodded and said he was proud of her for choosing the hardest path possible. The road to even attempting SEAL training was long and difficult. Sarah had to prove herself worthy just to get the chance to try. She spent 2 years in the regular Navy, excelling in every physical and mental challenge thrown her way. She completed underwater demolition training, advanced combat courses, and leadership programs that pushed her to her limits. Her commanding officers noticed her determination and recommended her for the SEAL selection process, making her one of only a handful of women ever given the opportunity. The day she arrived at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, California, Sarah knew her real test was about to begin. The base sprawled along the Pacific coastline, with training facilities that looked more like medieval torture chambers than modern military installations. The obstacle courses were designed to break spirits as much as bodies. The swimming pools were deep enough to drown in if you panicked. The sand dunes stretched for miles, perfect for conditioning runs that would leave grown men crying for their mothers. Sarah carried her gear bag toward the barracks, trying to ignore the stares from other recruits. She had expected this reaction. In a world where women made up less than 1% of those even attempting SEAL training, she was a curiosity at best and a target at worst. She kept her head high and her shoulders back, remembering her father's advice about projecting confidence even when you felt uncertain inside. The other recruits were exactly what she had imagined. They were mostly young men in their early 20s, all convinced they were the toughest person who had ever walked the earth. They came from different backgrounds, but they all shared the same cocky attitude that had carried them through their previous military training. Some were former college athletes who had dominated their sports. Others were soldiers from elite army units who thought SEAL training would be just another challenge to conquer. A few were Marines who believed their reputation for toughness would automatically translate into success. As Sarah found her assigned bunk and began unpacking her gear, she could hear conversations happening around her. The tone wasn't openly hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. She caught fragments of comments about whether standards would be lowered to accommodate her presence, whether she would be able to keep up with the physical demands, and whether having a woman in their class would somehow diminish their own achievements if they succeeded. She had heard all of this before during her time in the regular Navy, and she had developed a thick skin about it. But SEAL training was different. Here, the margin for error was zero. The instructors wouldn't care about her feelings or anyone else's. They would push every recruit to their absolute breaking point and beyond, looking for any sign of weakness or inability to perform under extreme stress. If she couldn't handle comments from fellow recruits, she definitely wouldn't survive what the instructors had planned for them. The first few days of training were designed to establish the baseline fitness level and mental toughness of each recruit. Sarah performed well in all the initial assessments, but she noticed that some of the other recruits seemed to take her success as a personal challenge. It was as if they needed to prove that they were still superior, even when she was clearly keeping pace with or outperforming them in certain areas. 5 recruits in particular seemed to have made it their mission to test her resolve. Their names were Jackson, Rodriguez, Thompson, Williams, and Baker. They were all physically impressive specimens who had excelled in their previous military assignments. Jackson was a former college football player who had been a star linebacker before joining the Army Rangers. Rodriguez had been a champion boxer before becoming a Marine. Thompson was a former Navy diver who thought SEAL training would be an easy transition. Williams had grown up on a ranch and possessed the kind of natural strength that came from years of hard physical labor. Baker was a former Special Forces operator who had already seen combat overseas and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been tested in real-world situations. These five had formed an unofficial alliance, supporting each other through the difficult training while maintaining a subtle campaign of psychological pressure against Sarah. They never did anything that could be reported to the instructors, but they made sure she knew they were watching her every move, waiting for her to fail so they could point to her failure as proof that women didn't belong in their elite brotherhood. The pressure wasn't just coming from those five recruits. Sarah could feel the eyes of every instructor and fellow trainee on her constantly. Some were hoping she would succeed and break new ground for women in special operations. Others were convinced she would fail and wanted to be there to witness it. The weight of representing all women in combat roles was enormous, and she felt it every moment of every day. During physical training sessions, Sarah pushed herself harder than she ever had before. The instructors seemed to take particular pleasure in testing her limits, making her carry heavier loads, swim longer distances, and complete more repetitions than some of the male recruits. She never complained or asked for special treatment, understanding that this extra scrutiny was part of the price she had to pay for being a pioneer. The psychological pressure was often worse than the physical challenges. During mealtimes, conversations would stop when she approached. During downtime in the barracks, jokes were made just loud enough for her to hear, but quietly enough that they couldn't be traced back to any specific person. The five recruits who had made themselves her unofficial opposition were masters of this subtle harassment, always staying just within the boundaries of what could be considered acceptable behavior while making it clear that they didn't believe she belonged there. Sarah's response to this treatment was to become even more focused and determined. She studied harder than anyone else, memorizing every detail of the training manuals and tactical procedures they were expected to learn. She volunteered for extra physical training sessions, arriving early and staying late to work on areas where she felt she needed improvement. She helped other recruits with their studies and training, earning the respect of some while irritating others who saw her helpfulness as another form of showing off. The training itself was unlike anything any of them had experienced before. The instructors were former Navy SEALs who had been through multiple combat deployments and knew exactly what it took to succeed in the most dangerous military operations in the world. They designed every exercise to simulate the physical and mental stress of real combat situations, pushing recruits to their absolute limits, and then demanding more. Swimming exercises took place in pools where recruits had to hold their breath for longer than seemed humanly possible while performing complex underwater tasks. Physical fitness sessions involved carrying heavy loads across soft sand for miles while being screamed at by instructors who seemed determined to break everyone's spirit. Classroom sessions covered advanced tactics, weapon systems, and military history, with tests that eliminated recruits who couldn't keep up academically. The most challenging aspect of the training was the unpredictability. Recruits never knew when they would be woken up in the middle of the night for an emergency drill. They never knew when a routine exercise would turn into a test of their ability to make life or death decisions under extreme pressure. The instructors were constantly watching for signs that someone was reaching their breaking point, and they would focus their attention on that person until they either found a way to push through or decided to quit. Sarah thrived in this environment in ways that surprised even herself. The chaos and unpredictability reminded her of the survival training her father had put her through as a child, but amplified to an almost impossible degree. While other recruits were struggling to adapt to the constant stress, she found herself becoming calmer and more focused as the challenges intensified. This success only intensified the resentment from some of her fellow recruits. The five who had appointed themselves as her primary opposition began to escalate their campaign of psychological warfare. They would make comments about her performance that were technically compliments, but delivered in tones that made it clear they thought she was receiving special treatment. They would question whether the instructors were being too easy on her during the most difficult exercises. They would wonder aloud whether her successes were real or if the standards were being quietly lowered to ensure she didn't fail. The tension came to a head during the fourth week of training, during what the instructors called Hell Week. This was 7 days of almost continuous physical and mental challenges designed to eliminate anyone who didn't have the absolute commitment necessary to become a Navy SEAL. Recruits would get less than 4 hours of sleep total during the entire week, while being pushed through the most grueling exercises the instructors could devise. By the third day of Hell Week, many recruits had already quit. The combination of exhaustion, physical pain, and psychological pressure had proven too much for them to handle. Those who remained were operating on pure determination, their bodies pushed far beyond what should have been possible for human beings to endure. It was during this period of extreme stress that the confrontation Sarah had been expecting finally occurred. The 5 recruits who had been building resentment toward her for weeks saw an opportunity to settle their grievances once and for all. They believed that the chaos and exhaustion of Hell Week would provide the perfect cover for them to finally break her spirit and prove that she didn't belong among them. The opportunity came during a brief rest period between exercises. The recruits were gathered in a supply shed, trying to grab a few minutes of recovery before the next challenge began. Most of them were too exhausted to do anything but lie on the ground and try to restore some energy to their depleted bodies. The instructors were outside preparing the next exercise, leaving the recruits alone for the first time in days. Sarah was sitting against a wall, checking her gear and trying to mentally prepare herself for whatever was coming next. She noticed the 5 recruits approaching her, but didn't immediately recognize the threat they represented. Her exhaustion was making it harder to read social situations accurately, and she initially thought they might be coming to discuss strategy for the upcoming exercise. Jackson, the former football player who seemed to have appointed himself as the leader of the group, was the first to speak. His voice was quiet enough that the other recruits in the shed wouldn't be able to hear clearly, but his tone carried an unmistakable edge of hostility. "We need to talk," he said, positioning himself directly in front of Sarah while the other 4 spread out around her in a way that blocked her from easily moving toward the exit. Sarah looked up at them, her training immediately kicking in as she assessed the situation. 5 men, all bigger and stronger than her, had positioned themselves in a way that suggested they were prepared for some kind of confrontation. She was trapped against the wall with limited options for movement, and the nearest instructor was outside where he wouldn't be able to see or hear what was happening inside the shed. Her mind began calculating distances and angles, identifying potential weapons in the immediate environment, and developing a plan for how to respond if this conversation turned physical. At the same time, she tried to project calm confidence, remembering her father's advice about never showing fear even when you were genuinely afraid. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through her system. Rodriguez, the former boxer, stepped closer and crouched down so that his face was level with hers. "We want to talk about how you're making all of us look bad," he said. "The instructors are going easy on you, and we're tired of pretending we don't notice." Sarah felt her anger building, but forced herself to remain calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied. "I'm doing the same exercises as everyone else, and meeting the same standards." Thompson, the former Navy diver, laughed bitterly. "The same standards? Are you serious? We've been watching you, and it's obvious they're cutting you slack because you're the token female. They don't want to be responsible for washing out the first woman to make it this far." Williams, who had been silent up to this point, decided to join the conversation. "The problem is that your special treatment makes us all look weak," he said. "If the standards are different for you, then our achievements don't mean as much. You're taking something away from every man who has ever earned the SEAL Trident." Baker, the former Special Forces operator who had actual combat experience, was the most intimidating of the group. He had been watching Sarah with cold, calculating eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had been tested in real battle situations. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to quit. Tonight. You're going to realize that this isn't the place for you, and you're going to ring the bell and go home. If you don't, we're going to make sure that every day of your remaining training is miserable. We'll find ways to sabotage your performance that the instructors will never trace back to us. We'll make sure you fail, but we'll do it in a way that looks like you just couldn't handle the pressure." The threat was clear, and Sarah understood that she was facing a moment that would define not just her own future, but potentially the future of women in special operations. These 5 men were giving her an ultimatum: quit voluntarily or be forced out through a campaign of sabotage and harassment that would be difficult to prove or stop. She looked at each of them in turn, seeing the absolute conviction in their eyes that they were justified in what they were doing. From their perspective, they were protecting something sacred from someone who didn't belong. They genuinely believed that her presence diminished their own achievements, and that forcing her to quit was not just acceptable, but necessary. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to defuse the situation by appealing to their sense of fairness or by pointing out that they were all supposed to be on the same team. She could threaten to report them to the instructors, though she knew that would likely result in retaliation that would be even harder to prove. She could try to leave the shed and avoid the confrontation entirely, though that would likely be seen as a sign of weakness that would encourage them to escalate their campaign against her. Or she could do what her father had taught her to do when cornered by people who were determined to hurt her. She could fight back with everything she had, using every advantage available to her, and show them that she was not someone who could be intimidated or bullied into giving up on her dreams. The 5 men were waiting for her response, confident that their superior numbers and size gave them an overwhelming advantage in this confrontation. They had positioned themselves in a way that would make it almost impossible for her to escape without their permission, and they were clearly prepared to use physical force if their psychological pressure wasn't sufficient to achieve their goals. What they didn't understand was that Sarah had been preparing for exactly this kind of situation her entire life. Her father had taught her that real combat wasn't about being the biggest or strongest person in the fight. It was about being the smartest, the most prepared, and the most willing to do whatever it took to survive and win. As she looked up at the 5 men surrounding her, Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her mind. This was the moment she had been training for without knowing it. Everything her father had taught her, every hour she had spent learning martial arts, every lesson about staying calm under pressure, had been preparing her for exactly this situation. She took a deep breath and prepared to show these 5 recruits that they had made a serious mistake in thinking they could intimidate her into giving up. In 30 seconds, everything was about to change in ways none of them could imagine. Sarah's father had spent years teaching her that the first rule of combat was to never let your opponent dictate the terms of engagement. Miguel Martinez had learned this lesson during his own military service in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and he had made sure his daughter understood that waiting for someone else to make the first move was often the same as choosing to lose. As the 5 recruits continued their attempt to intimidate her, Sarah was conducting a rapid tactical assessment of her situation. Jackson, the former football player, was directly in front of her, blocking her most obvious escape route. Rodriguez was crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell his sweat and see the anger in his eyes. Thompson, Williams, and Baker were positioned at different angles around her, creating what they thought was an inescapable trap. What they didn't realize was that their positioning, while effective for intimidation, actually worked to Sarah's advantage in several important ways. They were too close together, which would make it difficult for them to move quickly without getting in each other's way. They had focused so much attention on blocking her escape routes that they had left themselves vulnerable to a sudden, coordinated counterattack. Most importantly, their confidence in their overwhelming advantage had made them complacent about the possibility that she might actually fight back. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Her father had drilled into her that the key to winning against multiple opponents was speed, surprise, and the willingness to inflict maximum damage in the shortest possible time. You couldn't afford to engage in a prolonged fight against superior numbers, because eventually their advantages would overcome your skills. Instead, you had to strike hard and fast, disrupting their coordination and creating an opportunity to escape or gain a position of greater advantage. The moment came when Baker leaned forward to emphasize his threat about making her remaining training miserable. As he moved closer, he shifted his weight onto his forward foot, temporarily unbalancing himself in a way that created the opening Sarah had been waiting for. She exploded into motion with a speed that caught all 5 recruits completely off guard. Her first move was a vicious elbow strike to Rodriguez's temple, delivered with all the power she could generate from her seated position. The blow landed with a sickening crack, and Rodriguez collapsed immediately, his eyes rolling back as he lost consciousness before he even hit the ground. Before the others could react to what had happened to Rodriguez, Sarah was already flowing into her next attack. She grabbed Jackson's ankle and twisted it violently, while simultaneously sweeping his other leg, sending him crashing to the ground with enough force to knock the wind out of his lungs. As he fell, she used his body as leverage to launch herself upward and to her left, moving toward what had been the weakest point in their formation. Thompson, the former Navy diver, was the first to recover from his shock and attempt to grab her. He reached out with both hands, trying to use his size advantage to pin her against the wall. But Sarah had anticipated this move and was already sliding underneath his arms while driving her knee upward into his solar plexus. The impact lifted him off his feet and sent him stumbling backward into Williams, creating a tangle of bodies that temporarily removed both of them from the fight. Williams tried to push Thompson aside and launch his own attack, but Sarah was moving too quickly for him to track. She had learned from her martial arts training that the key to fighting multiple opponents was to never stay in one place long enough for them to coordinate their attacks. She had to keep moving, keep striking, and keep them off balance until she could either disable them all or create an opportunity to escape. Baker, the former Special Forces operator with actual combat experience, was the most dangerous of the five because he understood what was happening and was adapting to the changed situation. While his four companions were still struggling to process the fact that their victim had become their attacker, he was moving to intercept her next position and cut off her mobility. Sarah saw him coming and knew that this would be the critical moment of the entire confrontation. Baker had the training and experience to potentially match her skills, and if he managed to get his hands on her, the others would recover quickly enough to overwhelm her with their numbers. She had perhaps 3 seconds to neutralize him before the tactical situation shifted decisively against her. She feinted toward his left side, causing him to adjust his position to counter her expected attack. But instead of following through with the feint, she dropped low and spun to her right, using the momentum to drive her heel into the side of his knee with every ounce of force she could generate. The joint buckled with an audible pop, and Baker went down hard, clutching his leg and screaming in pain. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but the supply shed now looked like a battlefield. Rodriguez was unconscious, blood trickling from his temple where Sarah's elbow had connected. Jackson was gasping for air and trying to get back to his feet, but his twisted ankle wouldn't support his weight properly. Thompson was doubled over, clutching his stomach and making retching sounds as he struggled to breathe. Williams was the least injured of the group, but he was backing away from Sarah with wide eyes, clearly having lost all interest in continuing the fight. Baker was still conscious but immobilized by his injured knee, his face pale with pain and shock. Sarah stood in the center of the shed, breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. Her fists were clenched, and her body was still coiled with the readiness to continue fighting if any of them tried to resume their attack. The transformation from cornered victim to dominant fighter had been so sudden and complete that the 5 recruits were still struggling to understand what had happened to them. "Does anyone else want to discuss my qualifications?" Sarah asked, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She looked at each of them in turn, making it clear that she was prepared to continue the fight if necessary. Williams raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, taking another step backward. "We're done," he said quickly. "This is finished." Thompson was slowly straightening up, one hand still pressed against his stomach. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of pain and newfound respect. "How did you move that fast?" he asked, genuinely curious despite his obvious discomfort. "Training," Sarah replied simply. She wasn't interested in giving them a detailed explanation of her martial arts background or her father's unconventional approach to preparing her for military service. The demonstration she had just provided should be sufficient to answer any questions they might have about her capabilities. Jackson finally managed to get back to his feet, though he was clearly favoring his uninjured ankle. He looked around at his companions, seeing Rodriguez still unconscious and Baker writhing in pain on the ground. The reality of how quickly their plan had fallen apart was beginning to sink in, and he was starting to understand that they had seriously underestimated the woman they had tried to intimidate. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction he had shown earlier. The threat sounded more like a face-saving gesture than a genuine promise of future conflict. Sarah stepped closer to him, moving with the same fluid grace that had allowed her to defeat all 5 of them so quickly. "Actually, it is over," she said quietly. "You tried to bully me into quitting, and instead you learned that I'm not someone who can be bullied. Now you have a choice to make." She gestured toward the door of the shed, where they could hear the instructors beginning to gather the recruits for the next phase of their training. "You can spend the rest of this program trying to get revenge for what just happened here, in which case I'll be happy to give you another demonstration of why that's a bad idea. Or you can accept that I belong here just as much as any of you do, and we can focus on the real enemy, which is the training program that's trying to break all of us." Baker had managed to sit up against a wall, though his injured knee was clearly causing him significant pain. Despite his injury, he was looking at Sarah with something approaching professional admiration. As someone who had actually been in combat, he recognized the level of skill and training that had been required to defeat 5 opponents so quickly and efficiently. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked, his voice strained but respectful. "My father was a Marine," Sarah replied. He believed in being prepared for any situation. Baker nodded slowly, understanding now that they had made a fundamental error in their assessment of her capabilities. He taught you well, he admitted. I've seen Special Forces operators who couldn't have handled 5 opponents that efficiently. Rodriguez was beginning to stir, though he was clearly disoriented and in considerable pain. Sarah knelt beside him and helped him sit up, checking his pupils to make sure he didn't have a serious concussion. Her medical training from her time in the Navy kicked in automatically, and she found herself treating the man who had been trying to intimidate her just minutes earlier. You're going to have a headache for a while, she told him. But I don't think there's any permanent damage. You should probably get checked out by the medical staff when we finish this exercise. Rodriguez looked at her with confusion, struggling to reconcile the woman who was now helping him with the devastating fighter who had knocked him unconscious. Why are you helping me? He asked. Because we're supposed to be teammates, Sarah replied. What happened here was unfortunate, but it's over now. We're all trying to become Navy SEALs, which means we need to learn to work together instead of fighting each other. The sound of approaching footsteps indicated that the instructors were about to call them back to training. The 5 recruits looked at each other, silently communicating their understanding that what had happened in the shed needed to stay between them. Reporting the incident would likely result in all 6 of them being removed from the program, since fighting between recruits was strictly prohibited. Thompson helped Baker to his feet, supporting most of his weight to keep pressure off the injured knee. Can you make it through the rest of the exercise? He asked. Baker gritted his teeth and tested his weight on the damaged joint. I'll manage, he said. But we need to come up with an explanation for why I'm limping. Training injury during the last obstacle course, Williams suggested. Happens all the time during Hell Week. Sarah listened to them plan their cover story without comment. She understood that maintaining the secrecy of what had happened was in everyone's best interest, including her own. The instructors wouldn't care who had started the confrontation or whether she had been acting in self-defense. They would simply see 6 recruits who couldn't maintain discipline and unit cohesion under stress, and they would eliminate all of them from the program. As they prepared to leave the shed and rejoin the other recruits, Jackson turned to Sarah one final time. His earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by a grudging respect that he was still struggling to process. I owe you an apology, he said. We were wrong about you. You've proven that you belong here. Sarah nodded in acknowledgement of his words, but she didn't smile or act as if the confrontation had been a positive experience. I never wanted to prove anything through fighting, she replied. I wanted to prove it by becoming the best SEAL I could possibly be. That's still my goal. Rodriguez, who was now standing with the help of Williams, spoke up despite his obvious discomfort. For what it's worth, I don't think any of the instructors could have handled 5 opponents that efficiently. You didn't just prove you belong here. You proved you might be better than any of us. We're all here because we're the best at something, Sarah replied. The point of this training is to find out if we can be the best at everything that matters for this job. That's what I'm focusing on, and it's what all of you should be focusing on too. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of an instructor's whistle, signaling that the break period was over and the next phase of Hell Week was about to begin. The 6 recruits quickly composed themselves and prepared to file out of the shed, each of them carrying the knowledge that the dynamics of their class had just changed in fundamental ways. As they walked toward the assembly area where the other recruits were gathering, Sarah reflected on what had just happened. The confrontation had been inevitable from the moment she had arrived at the training center, and she was almost relieved that it was finally over. She had proven that she couldn't be intimidated or bullied into quitting, and she had done it in a way that demonstrated her tactical skills and combat effectiveness. More importantly, she had shown the 5 recruits who had opposed her that she was someone they could respect as an equal rather than someone they needed to drive away to protect their own status. The respect wouldn't come easily, and there would probably be tension for a while as they adjusted to their new understanding of who she really was. But the foundation for a working relationship had been established, and that was more than she had dared to hope for when she first arrived. The instructor who was waiting for them was Petty Officer First Class Morrison, a former SEAL who had earned his reputation during multiple combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was known for his ability to identify weaknesses in recruits and exploit them until the person either found a way to overcome their limitations or decided to quit the program. He looked at the 6 recruits as they approached, his experienced eyes immediately noting the signs that something had happened during the break period. Baker's slight limp was the most obvious indicator, but Morrison also noticed the way the group dynamics had shifted. The 5 male recruits who had previously maintained a subtle distance from Sarah were now positioning themselves closer to her, as if they had accepted her as part of their unit. There was tension in the air, but it felt different from the hostile tension that had existed before. This felt more like the productive tension that existed between people who had been through a shared challenge and come out stronger. "Is there something I should know about?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen every possible form of recruit drama during his years as an instructor. Baker twisted his knee during the last obstacle course. Thompson replied smoothly. "He says he can continue, but we were helping him work out the stiffness." Morrison studied Baker's face, looking for signs of deception. Baker met his gaze steadily, giving no indication that the explanation was anything other than the truth. After a moment, Morrison nodded his acceptance of the story. "If you can't keep up, you ring the bell," he told Baker. "We don't carry anyone through this program, regardless of the reason." "Understood, Petty Officer," Baker replied. "I'll keep up." Morrison's attention turned to the group as a whole. The next exercise is a 10-mile conditioning run followed by a 2-hour underwater demolition simulation. Anyone who can't complete both phases will be eliminated from the program. Are there any questions? None of the recruits spoke. They had learned that questions during Hell Week were generally interpreted as signs of weakness or uncertainty, and they were all determined to project confidence regardless of how they actually felt. "Outstanding," Morrison said. "Form up with the rest of your class. We begin in 2 minutes." As they moved to join the other recruits, Sarah felt the weight of what had just happened settling over her. The confrontation in the shed had been a turning point, but it was only the beginning of a much longer journey. She had proven that she couldn't be intimidated, but she still had to prove that she could complete one of the most demanding training programs in the world. The 5 recruits who had confronted her were now her reluctant allies, but she knew that earning their genuine respect would require more than winning a single fight. She would have to demonstrate day after day that she possessed not just the physical skills to be a SEAL, but the mental toughness, tactical intelligence, and leadership ability that the job demanded. As they began the 10-mile run, Sarah found herself running alongside Jackson, who was setting a pace that pushed everyone to their limits. He glanced at her as they settled into their rhythm, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. It was the look of someone who was beginning to understand that his assumptions had been wrong, and who was trying to figure out how to adjust his worldview accordingly. "That thing you did back there," he said quietly as they ran. "That wasn't just martial arts training. That was something else." Sarah nodded, understanding what he was really asking. "My father didn't just teach me how to fight," she replied. "He taught me how to win." Jackson considered this as they continued running, their feet pounding against the sand in rhythm with the dozens of other recruits around them. "I'm starting to think your father knew exactly what he was preparing you for," he said. "He always said that being prepared meant being ready for anything," Sarah replied, "including things you never expected to face." Behind them, the other 4 recruits were staying close, forming what was beginning to look like a cohesive unit rather than a collection of individuals competing against each other. The transformation wasn't complete, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But something fundamental had changed in the supply shed, and all 6 of them understood that they were now part of something larger than their individual ambitions. The run continued across the beach, through the surf, and into the hills beyond the training center. As Sarah maintained her pace alongside recruits who had tried to force her to quit just an hour earlier, she thought about her father and the lessons he had taught her about strength, courage, and the importance of never giving up on your dreams, no matter who tried to stand in your way. The real test of her abilities was still ahead of her, but she had taken the first crucial step toward proving that she belonged among the elite warriors who wore the Navy SEAL trident. And she had done it in a way that had earned the respect of people who had been determined to see her fail. 30 seconds had been enough to change everything. But Sarah knew that the changes had only just begun. The weeks following the confrontation in the supply shed marked a dramatic transformation in the dynamics of Sarah's training class. The 5 recruits who had once viewed her as an unwelcome intruder gradually began to see her as a valuable teammate, though the process wasn't always smooth or easy. Trust had to be built through shared hardships and proven competence, not just through a single moment of combat superiority. Jackson was the first to fully embrace the change in their relationship. As someone who had built his identity around being the strongest and most physically dominant person in any group, witnessing Sarah's devastating efficiency in combat had forced him to reevaluate his understanding of what real strength looked like. He began seeking her advice on tactical situations during training exercises, recognizing that her analytical approach to problem-solving complemented his more direct, aggressive style. Rodriguez took longer to adjust, partly because of the concussion he had sustained during their confrontation. The injury had been more serious than Sarah initially realized, and he struggled with headaches and concentration problems for several days afterward. However, as he recovered, he found himself studying Sarah's training methods and trying to understand how someone smaller than him could generate so much devastating power in such a confined space. His background in boxing gave him an appreciation for technical skill that transcended simple measurements of size and strength. Thompson's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of the group. As a former Navy diver, he had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure and think clearly in dangerous situations. Seeing Sarah maintain perfect tactical awareness while fighting 5 opponents simultaneously had shown him a level of mental clarity that he aspired to achieve. He began asking her to help him with the psychological aspects of their training, particularly the exercises designed to test their ability to make decisions while under extreme stress. Williams, who had grown up on a ranch and possessed natural strength that had always allowed him to dominate physical confrontations, struggled the most with accepting Sarah's capabilities. His identity was deeply tied to his physical superiority, and having been defeated so quickly by someone he could lift over his head required a fundamental shift in his self-perception. However, as he observed her performance in other aspects of their training, he began to understand that being a Navy SEAL required much more than raw physical power. Baker's acceptance came the quickest, largely because his combat experience had taught him to respect competence regardless of its source. He had worked with local fighters in Afghanistan and Iraq who could accomplish things that seemed impossible based on their physical appearance, and he understood that the most dangerous opponents were often those who looked least threatening. His injured knee became a constant reminder of the lessons Sarah had taught him, but he came to view it as a valuable education rather than a humiliating defeat. The instructors noticed the change in group dynamics immediately, though they didn't know the specific reason for the transformation. What they saw was a group of 6 recruits who had suddenly begun working together as a cohesive unit, supporting each other through the most difficult challenges instead of competing against each other for individual recognition. This kind of teamwork was exactly what the SEAL program was designed to develop, and the instructors began using Sarah's group as an example for the rest of the class. Petty Officer Morrison, in particular, took note of how the group handled challenges that had previously caused conflicts between Sarah and the 5 male recruits. During underwater demolition exercises, they automatically positioned themselves to cover each other's weaknesses and maximize their collective effectiveness. In tactical simulations, they demonstrated an ability to communicate and coordinate their actions that surpassed many groups that had been working together for much longer periods. The change wasn't lost on the other recruits in their class either. Many of them had been watching the tension between Sarah and the group of 5, waiting to see how the conflict would resolve itself. Some had expected Sarah to eventually quit under the pressure, while others had anticipated that the situation would escalate until the instructors were forced to intervene. Instead, they witnessed a sudden shift toward cooperation that seemed to benefit everyone involved. This development created ripple effects throughout the entire training program. Other recruits began reassessing their own attitudes toward Sarah and toward each other. Some who had been maintaining their distance from her out of uncertainty about how the social dynamics would play out began engaging with her more openly. Others who had been planning their own campaigns of subtle harassment decided that such tactics were more likely to backfire than succeed. The underwater demolition training became the first major test of the new group dynamic. These exercises required recruits to work in teams while holding their breath for extended periods, navigating complex underwater obstacle courses while carrying heavy equipment. The margin for error was essentially zero, because a mistake could easily result in drowning or serious injury. Sarah's team was assigned to disable a simulated enemy installation located at the bottom of a 30-foot deep training pool. The task required them to swim underwater for nearly 2 minutes while carrying explosive charges, navigate through a maze of obstacles designed to disorient and exhaust them, plant their charges in precise locations, and return to the surface before their breath ran out. Any team member who surfaced early would cause the entire team to fail the exercise. The challenge was made even more difficult by the fact that they had to perform the entire operation in complete darkness, using only their sense of touch to navigate and communicate with each other. The instructors had designed the exercise to simulate the conditions they might face during a real combat operation, where night vision equipment could malfunction and verbal communication would be impossible. As they prepared for the exercise, Baker approached Sarah with a tactical concern that demonstrated how much his attitude toward her had changed. "Your lung capacity is going to be the limiting factor for the team," he said quietly. "Not because you're weak, but because you're smaller than the rest of us. We need to modify our approach to account for that." Sarah appreciated his direct assessment of the situation, recognizing that he was now treating her as a tactical problem to be solved rather than as an unwelcome burden to be eliminated. "What do you suggest?" she asked. "We swim in a diamond formation with you in the center," Baker replied. "That way you get the most protection from water resistance. And we can assist you if you start to run out of air before we complete the mission." Thompson, who had been listening to their conversation, added his own suggestion. "We should also streamline the explosive placement sequence. Instead of having everyone plant charges independently, we should have the two fastest swimmers handle the entire job while the rest of US provides security and navigation support." Jackson nodded in agreement. "Sarah should be one of the swimmers handling the charges. She's got the steadiest hands and the best spatial awareness of any of us. The question is who should be her partner." Rodriguez volunteered immediately. "I'll do it. My boxing training taught me to hold my breath while maintaining fine motor control. Plus, Sarah and I have already learned to work together under pressure." The reference to their previous confrontation brought smiles to the faces of the group, though Sarah noticed that Rodriguez still winced slightly when he moved his head too quickly. The concussion she had given him was healing, but it served as a permanent reminder to all of them about what had happened in the supply shed. As they entered the water for their practice runs, Sarah found herself experiencing a level of teamwork that she had never expected to achieve with these particular individuals. Baker's tactical leadership guided their overall strategy, while Jackson's natural strength helped them navigate through the most physically demanding portions of the course. Thompson's diving experience proved invaluable in underwater navigation, while Williams's steady temperament helped keep everyone calm during the most stressful moments of the exercise. The transformation in their working relationship became even more apparent during the actual test. As they descended toward the simulated target, Sarah felt the familiar burn in her lungs that indicated she was approaching her breath-holding limits. Instead of panicking or trying to push through on her own, she tapped Baker's shoulder twice, using the signal they had developed to indicate that she needed assistance. Without hesitation, Baker adjusted the team's formation to reduce water resistance around Sarah, while Thompson moved closer to provide navigational guidance that would help her conserve energy. Rodriguez, who was swimming alongside her toward their target, modified his approach to the explosive placement sequence, taking responsibility for the more physically demanding tasks so that Sarah could focus on the precise technical work that required steady hands and clear thinking. The coordinated response allowed them to complete their mission with time to spare, surfacing just as other teams were beginning to struggle with the challenge of maintaining breath control while completing complex tasks. Their success wasn't just a testament to their individual abilities, but to their development as a functional unit that could adapt to challenges and support each other's weaknesses. Petty Officer Morrison was waiting for them as they climbed out of the pool, and his expression showed that he had been impressed by what he had observed. "That was textbook team coordination," he told them. "You identified your limitations, developed a strategy to address them, and executed that strategy under pressure. That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people alive in real operations." The praise felt particularly meaningful to Sarah because it acknowledged the team's performance rather than singling her out as either a liability or an exceptional individual. She had become simply another member of a high-performing unit, which was exactly what she had hoped to achieve when she first arrived at the training center. The success in underwater demolition training marked the beginning of a new phase in their development as a team. The 5 recruits who had once seen Sarah as a threat to their own achievements now recognized her as someone who made them all more effective. Her analytical approach to tactical problems complemented their various strengths, creating a synergy that elevated everyone's performance. This dynamic became even more important as the training program progressed into its most challenging phases. The instructors began presenting them with scenarios that had no clear solutions, forcing them to develop creative approaches to seemingly impossible problems. Sarah's ability to think unconventionally, combined with the diverse skill sets of her teammates, allowed them to succeed in situations where other teams struggled or failed entirely. One particularly memorable exercise involved a simulated hostage rescue in an environment designed to test every aspect of their training simultaneously. The scenario required them to infiltrate a heavily defended compound, neutralize multiple threats while avoiding civilian casualties, extract hostages who might be injured or uncooperative, and escape through a series of increasingly difficult obstacles. The entire operation had to be completed within a strict time limit, with failure at any stage resulting in elimination from the program. The exercise was designed to be nearly impossible for individual recruits to complete successfully, forcing them to rely heavily on teamwork and collective problem-solving. Many teams approached the challenge by trying to optimize their existing strengths, but Sarah's group recognized that the scenario required them to develop entirely new capabilities. Their solution involved a complex coordination of individual roles that played to each person's unique abilities while covering for their weaknesses. Baker used his combat experience to develop an infiltration strategy that minimized their exposure to enemy fire. Jackson's physical strength allowed him to breach barriers that other teams couldn't overcome. Thompson's diving background proved useful for an unexpected underwater approach route that the instructors hadn't anticipated anyone would attempt. Rodriguez's boxing reflexes helped him neutralize threats in close-quarters combat situations. Williams's ranch background gave him an intuitive understanding of how to handle panicked hostages who were more likely to flee than cooperate. Sarah's role in the operation showcased how completely her relationship with the team had evolved. Instead of trying to prove that she could perform any task as well as the men, she focused on the tactical coordination that tied all of their individual contributions together into a coherent plan. Her ability to maintain situational awareness while under stress allowed her to make real-time adjustments to their strategy as unexpected complications arose during the exercise. The result was a flawless execution that not only succeeded in completing all mission objectives, but did so in a way that impressed even the instructors who had designed the scenario. Their time was faster than any team had achieved in the previous 3 years of the program, and they accomplished the mission without sustaining any simulated casualties or causing any unacceptable collateral damage. More importantly, their success demonstrated that Sarah's presence in the program wasn't just about breaking barriers or making political statements about gender equality in combat roles. She had become an integral part of a team that was performing at a level that exceeded what any of them could have achieved individually. Her value wasn't symbolic, it was practical and measurable in terms of mission effectiveness. The other recruits in their class began seeking opportunities to work with Sarah's team, recognizing that their collaborative approach was producing superior results across multiple types of challenges. Instead of being seen as an outsider who needed special accommodation, Sarah had become someone that others wanted to emulate and learn from. This shift in perception extended beyond their immediate training environment. Word of their exceptional performance began reaching instructors from other phases of the SEAL program, who started observing their training exercises to understand what was creating such outstanding results. Some of these instructors had been skeptical about allowing women into the program, but witnessing the practical benefits of Sarah's participation began changing their minds about the issue. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal for everyone involved. The 5 men who had once tried to force Sarah to quit found themselves becoming her strongest supporters, defending her capabilities when other recruits or instructors questioned whether she truly belonged in the program. They had learned through direct experience that their initial assumptions about her had been completely wrong, and they were determined to ensure that others didn't make the same mistake. Sarah, for her part, discovered that earning the respect of people who had initially opposed her was far more satisfying than she had anticipated. The knowledge that she had converted enemies into allies through demonstrated competence rather than through political pressure or special treatment gave her confidence that her achievements were genuine and sustainable. As they moved into the final phases of their training, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that confrontation in the supply shed. 30 seconds of combat had indeed changed everything, but not in the way any of them had expected. Instead of proving that women didn't belong in special operations, the incident had demonstrated that assumptions about capability based on gender, size, or appearance were often completely wrong. The real test of their newly formed team unity would come in the graduation exercises that lay ahead, where they would face challenges designed to push them to their absolute limits one final time. The final phase of SEAL training was unlike anything the recruits had experienced during their previous months at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. Known as the Crucible, this phase was designed to test not just their individual capabilities, but their ability to function as a cohesive unit under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The instructors had learned through decades of experience that technical skills and physical fitness, while necessary, were not sufficient to create effective special operations personnel. The ultimate test was whether recruits could maintain their effectiveness when everything was going wrong, and failure meant not just personal disappointment, but potentially the lives of their teammates. Sarah's team had evolved far beyond the collection of individuals who had once been at odds with each other. The confrontation in the supply shed now felt like something that had happened in a different lifetime, though it had only been a few months earlier. The 6 recruits had forged bonds through shared hardship that went deeper than ordinary military camaraderie. They had learned to anticipate each other's reactions, communicate without words, and function as a unified entity even when exhaustion and stress had pushed them beyond their normal limits. The crucible began with a briefing that was intentionally vague and misleading. The recruits were told that they would be conducting a simulated prisoner extraction from a hostile territory, but they were given incomplete intelligence about enemy strength, terrain challenges, and mission timeline. This was by design, as real special operations rarely unfolded according to plan, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances was often the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Commander Patricia Hayes conducted the briefing herself, rather than delegating it to the usual training staff. Hayes was a veteran of multiple combat deployments who had personally led some of the most dangerous special operations missions of the past decade. Her presence indicated that this exercise was being treated with the same seriousness as an actual combat operation, and her reputation for accepting nothing less than perfection created an atmosphere of intense focus among the recruits. Your target is a high-value asset being held in a facility approximately 40 miles from this location, Commander Hayes told the assembled recruits. Intelligence suggests that the prisoner has information critical to ongoing operations, and extraction must be accomplished within the next 72 hours. After that point, the asset will likely be moved to a location where recovery will be impossible. She activated a display screen showing satellite imagery of their operational area, though Sarah immediately noticed that key details seemed to be missing or obscured. The facility is defended by an unknown number of hostile personnel using military-grade equipment. The exact layout of the building is uncertain, and there may be additional security measures that our intelligence sources were unable to identify. Jackson leaned forward slightly, studying the limited imagery with the tactical eye he had developed over months of training. Something about the briefing felt different from their previous exercises, though he couldn't immediately identify what was creating that impression. The level of uncertainty was higher than usual, and Commander Hayes seemed to be taking unusual care to emphasize the potential dangers they would face. Your insertion will be by boat under cover of darkness, Hayes continued. You will then proceed overland to the target facility, conduct the extraction, and return to a designated pickup point for evacuation. Standard rules of engagement apply, with the additional constraint that civilian casualties must be avoided at all costs. Baker raised his hand, his combat experience making him sensitive to gaps in the operational briefing. Ma'am, what's the backup plan if the primary extraction point is compromised? Hayes' smile was thin and humorless. There isn't one. If you miss your pickup window, you'll be on your own until we can arrange an alternative extraction, which could take days or weeks depending on the tactical situation. This revelation sent a ripple of concern through the assembled recruits. Previous exercises had always included multiple contingency plans and safety measures designed to prevent genuine danger to the trainees. The suggestion that they might be abandoned if their mission went wrong felt uncomfortably realistic. Thompson, drawing on his diving background, asked about environmental conditions. What kind of weather are we looking at for the insertion? Storm front moving through the area, Hayes replied. Expect rough seas, limited visibility, and the possibility of equipment malfunctions due to water exposure. The conditions will be challenging for boat operations, but they'll also provide additional concealment for your approach. Sarah listened to the briefing while analyzing the tactical challenges they would face. The combination of uncertain intelligence, hostile weather, and limited backup support created a scenario where success would require flawless execution and the ability to adapt quickly to unexpected complications. It was exactly the kind of mission that separated elite special operations personnel from conventional military units. Rodriguez was thinking along similar lines, his boxing background having taught him to anticipate his opponent's strategy while preparing multiple responses to different scenarios. Are we operating alone, or will there be supporting elements in the area? You're on your own, Hayes confirmed. This is a small unit operation with minimal signature. Any support would compromise the mission security and alert hostile forces to your presence. Williams, who had learned to appreciate tactical complexity through his work with Sarah's team, asked about communication procedures. What's our contact schedule with base operations? Radio silence until mission completion, Hayes replied. You'll have emergency communication capability, but using it will likely compromise your position and potentially result in mission failure. The briefing continued with equipment issue and final preparation instructions, but Sarah found herself focusing on the psychological aspects of what they were being asked to do. The Crucible was designed to test their readiness for real combat operations, but it was also a final evaluation of their character and judgment under extreme pressure. The instructors would be watching to see who maintained their composure when everything started going wrong, and who would crack under the stress of genuine uncertainty and danger. As they prepared their equipment for the mission, Sarah's team fell into the collaborative rhythm they had developed over months of training together. Each person had specific responsibilities based on their strengths, but they all understood everyone else's roles well enough to provide backup if needed. The level of coordination they had achieved would have been impossible without the trust that had been forged through their previous conflicts and reconciliations. Baker took point on overall mission planning, his combat experience making him the natural choice for tactical leadership. Jackson focused on the physical challenges they would face, ensuring that their equipment loads were optimized for the long overland movement they would have to complete. Thompson handled all aspects of the water insertion, from boat handling to waterproofing their gear. Rodriguez concentrated on close-quarters combat planning, anticipating the kind of fighting they might face inside the target facility. Williams took responsibility for logistics and contingency planning, making sure they had backup options for every piece of critical equipment. Sarah's role had evolved into something that none of them had initially anticipated. She had become the team's tactical coordinator, responsible for integrating everyone's individual contributions into a coherent operational plan. Her ability to see the big picture while tracking multiple details simultaneously made her uniquely suited for this responsibility, and the others had come to rely on her judgment in complex situations. As they finalized their preparations, Sarah noticed that the other teams in their class seemed to be approaching the exercise with less coordination and systematic planning. Many of the recruits were still operating as collections of individuals rather than unified teams, and she suspected that this difference would become critically important as the exercise progressed. The boat insertion took place during the early hours of the morning, with waves high enough to make even experienced sailors seasick. The small inflatable boats they were using pitched and rolled violently as they made their way toward the coastline, soaking everyone with frigid seawater that made their gear feel twice as heavy as normal. The darkness was absolute, with heavy clouds blocking any light from the moon or stars. Thompson's expertise proved invaluable during the approach, as he navigated by compass and instinct while the rest of the team focused on maintaining their equipment and preparing for the overland phase of the mission. The rough seas that Commander Hayes had warned them about turned out to be worse than expected, and several times their boat came close to capsizing as particularly large waves struck them from unexpected directions. The landing site was a rocky beach that offered concealment, but made getting ashore safely extremely difficult. Waves crashed against the rocks with enough force to seriously injure anyone who mistimed their approach, and the team had to wait for the right moment to make their run to shore. When Thompson finally gave the signal, they moved with practiced efficiency, dragging their boat far enough inland to prevent it from being swept away by the surf. Once ashore, they immediately encountered their first major deviation from the mission briefing. The terrain they found themselves in was far more challenging than the satellite imagery had suggested, with dense vegetation and steep ravines that would make their planned route to the target facility nearly impossible to follow. Baker quickly recognized that they would have to completely revise their approach, adding hours to their timeline and significantly increasing their exposure to potential detection. The intelligence was wrong, he told the team as they huddled together to assess their situation. We can't follow the planned route. We need to find an alternative that doesn't get us lost in this terrain. Sarah studied their map by the light of a heavily shielded flashlight, comparing the actual landscape to what they had been led to expect. We can follow the ridge line to the east, she suggested. It's longer, but the footing will be more secure, and we'll have better visibility of the target area when we get close. Rodriguez agreed with her assessment. Plus, if we run into trouble, the high ground gives us better options for fighting or withdrawing. The decision to change their route proved to be the first of many adaptations they would have to make as the exercise continued to deviate from their original planning. The instructors had deliberately provided inaccurate information about virtually every aspect of the mission, forcing the teams to demonstrate their ability to think independently and solve problems without relying on predetermined solutions. The overland movement took nearly twice as long as they had anticipated, with frequent pauses to navigate around obstacles that hadn't appeared on their maps. Williams proved invaluable during this phase, his ranch background giving him an instinctive understanding of how to move through difficult terrain without leaving obvious tracks. Jackson's physical strength allowed him to help teammates over particularly challenging sections, while Thompson's experience with underwater navigation translated surprisingly well to land-based movement and limited visibility. As they approached the target facility, they discovered another major discrepancy between their briefing and reality. Instead of the isolated building they had been expecting, they found a complex of multiple structures surrounded by sophisticated security measures that would make their planned approach extremely dangerous. Guard patrols were more frequent and better organized than intelligence had suggested, and the facility appeared to be occupied by significantly more personnel than they had prepared for. Sarah called for a planning session as they observed the target from a concealed position several hundred yards away. The team had learned to trust her tactical assessments, and they gathered around her as she outlined the challenges they were facing. "The original plan won't work," she said quietly. "There are too many guards, and the facility layout is completely different from what we were told to expect. We need to develop a new approach that accounts for the actual conditions." Baker nodded grimly. "This feels more like a real operation than a training exercise. Either the instructors have really stepped up their realism, or something else is going on here." Thompson had been studying the guard rotations through binoculars, and his observations added another layer of complexity to their situation. The security measures look professional. These aren't actors playing roles. These people know what they're doing. The realization that they might be facing genuine opposition rather than training cadre created a sobering shift in the team's mindset. If this was a real operation rather than an elaborate exercise, then the stakes were far higher than anyone had anticipated. Failure wouldn't just mean a poor training evaluation. It could mean serious injury or death for the team members. Rodriguez voiced what everyone was thinking. "Are we sure this is still a training exercise?" Jackson's expression was grim as he considered the possibilities. "Whether it is or isn't, we have a mission to complete. We can sort out the details later, but right now we need to focus on getting that prisoner out safely." Sarah felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders as she realized that the team was looking to her for a solution to their impossible situation. The tactical challenges were unlike anything they had faced during their previous training, and the consequences of failure were potentially catastrophic. Everything they had learned about working together as a team was about to be tested under conditions that would push them beyond their limits. The plan she developed over the next hour was complex, risky, and required perfect coordination from every team member. It was also their only realistic chance of success in a situation that seemed designed to ensure their failure. As she outlined the details to her teammates, Sarah reflected on how far they had all come since that confrontation in the supply shed months earlier. In 30 seconds, everything had changed for all of them. Now they were about to discover whether those changes had truly prepared them for the ultimate test of their abilities as Navy SEALs. Sarah's plan required the team to split into 3 coordinated elements, each with a specific mission that would contribute to the overall success of the prisoner extraction. The complexity of the operation was far beyond anything they had attempted during their training, but the months of working together had given them confidence in their ability to execute sophisticated tactics under extreme pressure. The first element consisted of Thompson and Williams, who would create a diversion on the opposite side of the facility from the main extraction point. Their job was to draw the attention of as many guards as possible without getting themselves killed or captured, providing a window of opportunity for the other elements to complete their missions. Thompson's diving background made him expert at underwater approaches, and they would use the facility's water treatment system to get close to their target without being detected. The second element was Baker and Rodriguez, who would infiltrate the main building and locate the prisoner. Baker's combat experience would be crucial for navigating the interior of a hostile facility, while Rodriguez's boxing reflexes would help them deal with any close-quarters combat situations they encountered. Their route would take them through the facility's maintenance areas, using service tunnels and utility corridors that wouldn't be as heavily guarded as the main entrances. Sarah and Jackson formed the third element, responsible for securing the extraction route and providing backup support for the other two teams. Jackson's physical strength would be essential for breaching any barriers they encountered, while Sarah's tactical coordination would allow her to adapt their plan in real time as the situation developed. They would position themselves at a central location where they could respond quickly to support either of the other elements if things went wrong. The timing of the operation was critical, with all three elements having to coordinate their actions to within seconds of each other. Any significant deviation from the planned timeline would likely result in the entire mission falling apart, with potentially catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. As they moved into position for the assault, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had been cornered in a supply shed by 5 hostile recruits felt like a completely different person from the tactical leader who was now preparing to lead a complex special operations mission. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but through months of proving herself in increasingly challenging situations until her teammates had no choice but to accept her as an equal. Thompson and Williams reached their diversion point first, using the facility's drainage system to approach their target undetected. The water was cold and filthy, but it provided concealment that allowed them to get within 50 yards of the guard post they intended to attack. Their explosives were improvised devices created from training materials, but they would create enough noise and confusion to draw attention away from the main facility. Baker and Rodriguez encountered their first serious obstacle when they discovered that the service tunnels they had planned to use were blocked by security gates that hadn't appeared on any of their maps. The facility's defensive measures were far more sophisticated than they had anticipated, requiring them to find alternative routes through areas that were much more heavily monitored than their original plan had accounted for. Sarah monitored both elements' progress through hand signals and carefully timed radio transmissions that lasted only seconds to avoid detection. The coordination required was enormously complex, as she had to track the movements of 6 different people while simultaneously watching for changes in enemy patrol patterns and adjusting their timeline to account for unexpected delays. The diversion began exactly on schedule, with Thompson and Williams's explosives creating a spectacular display of light and sound that immediately drew the attention of every guard in the facility. The response was swift and professional, with security teams moving to investigate the disturbance using tactics that confirmed Baker's suspicion that they were facing real opposition rather than training cadre. As guards rushed toward the diversion point, Baker and Rodriguez made their move into the main facility. The prisoner was being held in a basement detention area that required them to descend 3 levels through corridors that were still partially guarded despite the distraction outside. Their movement had to be silent and efficient, as any alarm would bring overwhelming force down on their position before they could complete their mission. Sarah and Jackson positioned themselves at the facility's main entrance, ready to provide covering fire for the extraction team when they emerged with the prisoner. What they found was a scene of controlled chaos, with guards rushing around in response to the diversion while maintaining enough discipline to continue their primary security duties. The professionalism of their opposition was beginning to make Sarah question whether this really was a training exercise. Inside the facility, Baker and Rodriguez located the prisoner in a cell that was guarded by 2 personnel who were clearly more focused on the explosions outside than on their immediate responsibilities. The takedown was quick and silent, with Rodriguez's boxing speed allowing him to neutralize both guards before they could raise an alarm. The prisoner turned out to be a middle-aged man who appeared to be genuinely terrified rather than an instructor playing a role for training purposes. "Who are you?" the man asked as Baker worked to unlock his restraints. "Are you Americans?" "We're here to get you out," Baker replied, avoiding a direct answer to the question about their nationality. "Can you walk?" "I think so," the prisoner said, though he was clearly weakened by his captivity. "They've been interrogating me for days. I wasn't sure anyone was coming." The genuine fear and relief in the man's voice convinced both Baker and Rodriguez that this was no training exercise. They were conducting a real prisoner extraction under combat conditions, with lives hanging in the balance if they failed. The realization added urgency to their movements as they began making their way back toward the extraction point. Meanwhile, Thompson and Williams were discovering that their diversion had been perhaps too successful. The guards investigating the explosions were conducting a methodical search that was gradually working its way toward their hiding position. They had accomplished their mission of drawing attention away from the main facility, but now they faced the challenge of extracting themselves without getting killed or captured. Sarah's coordination became even more critical as the operation entered its final phase. She had to guide Thompson and Williams away from the search teams closing in on their position, while simultaneously directing Baker and Rodriguez along the safest route to the extraction point with their rescued prisoner. Jackson provided security and was prepared to lay down covering fire if any of the teams encountered opposition they couldn't handle on their own. The extraction itself required split-second timing. Baker and Rodriguez emerged from the facility with the prisoner just as the search teams were beginning to realize that the diversion had been exactly that, a diversion designed to draw their attention away from the real target. Shouts of alarm echoed across the compound as guards began converging on their position from multiple directions. Jackson opened fire with his rifle, not to kill but to force the guards to take cover and by precious seconds for the extraction team to reach their predetermined rally point. His shots were carefully aimed to be intimidating rather than lethal, but they had the desired effect of disrupting the guards' coordination long enough for Baker and Rodriguez to escape the immediate area with their prisoner. Sarah coordinated the team's movement toward their extraction point while simultaneously calling for their evacuation pickup. The radio call was deliberately brief and coded, but she hoped it would be enough to bring their boat back to the landing site in time to get them all safely away from the facility. Thompson and Williams managed to break contact with the search teams pursuing them by using the same drainage system they had used to approach their diversion point. The water was even more unpleasant than it had been earlier, but it provided concealment that allowed them to evade their pursuers and make their way back toward the team's rally point. The overland movement back to their extraction point was a running firefight that tested every aspect of their training. The guards pursuing them were well-equipped and determined, using tactics that forced the team to constantly change their route and adjust their defensive positions. The rescued prisoner was slowing them down, but abandoning him was never an option they considered. Sarah found herself making tactical decisions in real time that would have been impossible without the months of training and team building that had brought them to this point. She coordinated covering fire, directed movement routes, and managed their ammunition and equipment while maintaining constant awareness of their overall strategic situation. The level of responsibility was enormous, but she had learned to trust her instincts and the capabilities of her teammates. Jackson's physical strength proved crucial during several moments when they had to carry the weakened prisoner over difficult terrain while under fire. Thompson's navigation skills kept them moving in the right direction despite the chaos of their running battle. Rodriguez's speed and agility allowed him to scout ahead and identify threats before they became critical. Williams's steadiness under pressure helped maintain unit cohesion when the situation threatened to become completely chaotic. Baker's combat experience provided the tactical leadership that kept them focused on their mission rather than getting drawn into unnecessary fights. When they finally reached their extraction point, they found their boat waiting for them with engines running and crew ready to provide immediate evacuation. The transition from land to sea was accomplished under fire, with bullets striking the water around them as they pushed off from shore and headed for open ocean. As their boat pulled away from the coastline and the sounds of pursuit faded behind them, Sarah allowed herself a moment to process what they had just accomplished. The mission had been far more challenging and dangerous than any training exercise they had previously encountered, and she was beginning to suspect that it had been something more than training from the beginning. Commander Hayes was waiting for them when they returned to the naval base, along with several other officers who Sarah didn't recognize. The debriefing that followed confirmed her suspicions about the nature of their mission. They had indeed conducted a real prisoner extraction operation, rescuing a civilian contractor who had been captured while working in a foreign country where the United States military couldn't operate openly. "Your training is now complete," Commander Hayes told them. "What you just accomplished was your final examination, conducted under real operational conditions with genuine stakes. You have demonstrated that you possess not only the technical skills necessary to be Navy SEALs, but the judgment, courage, and teamwork required to succeed in the most challenging special operations missions." The revelation that they had been conducting a real rescue mission while believing it was a